Wartime Russia is a country where people receive up to 25 years in prison for their anti-war position. Almost 20,000 cases were initiated against Russians who spoke out against the war in Ukraine, with over 350 of those becoming criminal cases. But it's not all bad. Vladimir Putin also pardons convicts. For example, he pardoned at least 17 violent murderers so that they could be sent to fight in the war. Here is how it started. Prior to commencing the mobilization in late September of 2022, when the Russian first experienced troubles on the battlefield, the government began conscripting convicted felons straight out of prison to send them to the front lines. The only way to legally support such actions is by having the president, Vladimir Putin, pardon these prisoners. This phenomenon was made famous by the late chief of the Wagner Group, Evgeny Prigozhin, when he personally visited penitentiaries to recruit convicts. However, the conscription process is quite competitive because not all prisoners would be considered for pardoning. Prigozhin himself said that they were looking to recruit specifically murderers and bandits, and that third-degree murderers were unlikely to make the cut. Here are some of the most violent and ghastly criminals that Vladimir Putin pardoned so that they could be sent to the front lines of the war in Ukraine. It is important to note that these prisoners are not being mobilized. They sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense, meaning that after they've served the term of the contract, they are free to go home. Putin's press secretary, Dmitry Peskov, called it blood atonement. In May of 2014, Dmitry S. and Yuri P. stabbed two World War II veterans to death. The perpetrators broke into the elderly couple's home, stole their medals and all the money they could find, and murdered the pensioners. Dmitry S. was sentenced to 21 years in prison, and Yuri P. to 16. In 2022, both murderers were pardoned and sent to fight in the Ukraine war. Yuri was killed in battle, whereas Dmitry served his term and returned to the village where they committed the crime, and now lives close to the granddaughter of his victims. In 2012, Stanislav Bogdanov murdered a local justice of the peace in Veliki Novgorod, Sergei Zhiganov. The criminal hit him 40 times with a coal rake, took his gold chain and bank cards, and afterwards dropped a dumbbell on his head. In 2013, the murderer was sentenced to 23 years in prison. In 2022, he was pardoned and conscripted by the Wagner Group. He received medals for his service and returned home. In 2021, an Arkhangelsk region resident, Vyacheslav Samoilov, gruesomely murdered his girlfriend, a 33-year-old mother of a schoolboy. He dismembered her body with a handsaw, hid her body parts in various places, and burned her belongings. He only got 9 years and 7 months in prison, but having served less than half of the time, he was pardoned and sent to the front lines of the Ukraine war. He returned home 3 months later. In 2003, a resident of Nizhny Tagil, Evgeny Dudrov, and his friends kidnapped a 16-year-old boy and demanded ransom from his parents. When they did not receive the ransom, they choked the schoolboy to death. This murder case was only solved 16 years later, and in 2021, Dudrov was sentenced to 12 years in prison. He was pardoned and gained his freedom in 2023 by serving in the Wagner Group for 6 months. In 2012, a resident of the island of Sakhalin, Denis Gorin, was sentenced to 22 years in a maximum security prison for murdering a man in 2010. Gorin is a cannibal and he ate the flesh of his victim. This was not his first sentence, as in 2003 he received 10 years in prison for murder and desecration. After the war in Ukraine began, he was pardoned and sent to the front lines. He is now in a military hospital on Sakhalin, set to be released after he recovers. To put things into perspective, the men that were mobilized are staying in the trenches indefinitely. This spurred some protests of the mobilized men's families, who demanded their husbands, brothers, and fathers be returned home. The violent criminals that get pardoned and sign a contract with the Ministry of Defense get to go home in 6 months, sometimes even sooner. In a way, they were handpicked by Putin, since it was required of him to pardon them first. This is Putin's Squad.